Three Tales of Disturbing Neighbors 1. The dinner party lie a few years ago, I moved to the quiet outskirts of a new city, an area that felt more like a small, spread-out town. The streets were calm, and the houses were spaced far apart. I had bought a small, pleasant house and, not being much of a social person, kept mostly to myself while unpacking. A few days after moving in, a knock came at my front door. I was in the middle of unpacking and answered it to find a tall, older man with black hair and a patchy beard standing there. He introduced himself as Todd, a neighbor from a few doors down, extending a friendly welcome to the neighborhood. I appreciated the gesture, returned his friendliness, and we engaged in polite small talk for a few minutes. He asked all the standard neighborly questions: why I moved, where I came from, and if I had moved with anyone. At the time, none of it seemed off-putting. He just appeared to be a decent neighbor. He mentioned he lived with his wife, Sarah, and that they both enjoyed the area's peace and quiet. Todd seemed like a genuinely nice guy, and it was comforting to know a friendly face was nearby, even if he was 20 or 30 years my senior. The next few days were spent settling in and taking short walks. Oddly, I couldn't help but notice that nobody was ever outside. Every time I looked or walked around, the neighborhood was completely empty. No neighbors on porches, no one in the yards. The whole area felt hollow, eerily quiet in a way that made me feel profoundly out of place and a little depressed. Around 4 o'clock one afternoon, Todd came by again. This time, he was extending an invitation. He and his wife were hosting a dinner get-together with the other neighbors that night at 7:30 p.m. at his place. He said it would be a great chance for me to meet everyone. Given the lack of life I had witnessed, this invitation was completely unexpected. I had assumed everyone kept to themselves, but this seemed like my only chance to meet people, so I accepted. He looked forward to seeing me there, then left. I was excited, but mostly nervous. I knew I should go. At 7:30 p.m., I got ready and walked over to his house. The entire neighborhood was dark and silent, peaceful, yet unnervingly strange, reinforcing that hollow feeling of being utterly alone. When I reached Todd's place, it looked inactive. There were no lights blazing and no cars parked outside. I walked up to the door. It was already cracked open, but I knocked anyway. Immediately, Todd yelled from inside for me to come on in and make myself at home. His voice echoed loudly through the hallways, and the house was absolutely silent. No other voices, no sounds of movement, not what I expected from a neighborhood get-together. I took a few steps inside. His home was dimly lit, cast in moody shadows. I headed down the hallway toward the kitchen, where I thought his voice came from, but when I arrived, it was empty. He wasn't there. I called out his name. Then I called out his wife's name. No response. I noticed the room was bare. No food on the counter, no signs of cooking, no decorations, nothing suggesting any kind of gathering had taken place or was about to. The realization hit me with a sickening force. Nobody else was here. Just then, I heard the front door slam shut. Startled, I quickly called out Todd's name again, but was met only by the disturbing silence of his house. I hurried back toward the front door, confirming it was now closed. A sense of imminent, paralyzing danger crept into me, a fear I had never felt before in my life. I rushed to the front door, finding it secured by 3 different locks, instantly confirming this was no accident. As I frantically fumbled with the locks, Todd's voice suddenly called out my name, asking in a deepening, less friendly tone, "Where are you going?" I could hear him quickly approaching behind me, his voice growing darker with every syllable. I got the door open just in time and sprinted back to my own home. I debated whether to call the police but ultimately decided I must, letting the officers determine his intent. I'm glad I did, because a couple of minutes after making it home, Todd showed up, banging on my door and peering into my windows from outside. He left before the officers arrived, but the situation only grew weirder from there. During the questioning, the police discovered that Todd had never planned any get-together and did not have a wife named Sarah. Nor did he live with anyone at all. He had lived there alone for over a decade. Essentially, everything he had told me was a complete fabrication, a carefully constructed lie designed solely to lure me into his home. Unfortunately, nothing definitive could be done. While everyone, including the police, acknowledged the situation was far too odd for him to be innocent, there was no legal way to prove he intended harm. I moved away from that place as fast as possible. Every so often, I look up his name, hoping he's been arrested, because I know if he isn't, he's just waiting to find another victim to lure into his solitary house. Whatever he planned to do to me that night, I pray he never gets the chance to follow through. 2. The stalker across the street. I used to live in a standard, unassuming neighborhood right in the center of an ordinary town. Most families around there had been residents for decades, myself included, as I'd grown up in the house and inherited it from my parents. This was in my 3rd year of living there alone. One fall, a new neighbor moved into a house directly across the street from mine. I wasn't the type to go introduce myself, but I watched him moving his possessions out of a U-Haul. He looked like any other ordinary guy. A week went by without anything to note until one evening. I got home from work and saw him standing outside my house. I recognized him right away, but he wasn't walking past or walking up to the door. He was just standing on the sidewalk, looking intently at my house. I pulled into the garage and got out to go say hello and see what he wanted. But in the 20 seconds it took me to exit my car, he was already gone. He must have hurried away. I found it unusual, but I didn't worry too much. Since I had the next day off, I figured if he was just stopping by, I'd be home to answer the door. I went about my night and, surprisingly, forgot about the encounter quickly. He didn't cross my mind again until the next morning. While I was outside grabbing the mail, I happened to glance across the street at his house. Nothing seemed to be going on. No lights were on. But just before I looked away, I caught a quick glimpse of something moving in an upstairs window. I did a double take, but all I saw were the blinds gently shifting back and forth, as if he had just been standing there watching me. I felt a little unsettled but went back inside. Could have been a coincidence, I thought, or him just scoping out his new neighborhood. I tried to keep myself calm. I spent the day catching up on chores and relaxing. I did occasionally peek out the windows, driven by a persistent gut feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked, though, I saw nothing. Once the sun set, I was sure the strange behavior was over for the night. But I decided to take one last look out the window, and that's when I saw him again. He was standing at the end of my driveway. Something about his posture made me instantly sure he had just retreated from the top of the driveway, meaning he had been up close to my house just moments ago. I went to the front door, opened it, and walked out toward him. I wasn't trying to seem angry. I was probably too friendly, in fact. I just wanted to ask him what was going on and make sure everything was all right. But the second he saw me, he started walking quickly down the sidewalk, pretending as if he was just out for a casual stroll. I called out a couple of times, only to be completely ignored. Once I reached the halfway point of my driveway and realized he wouldn't turn around, I gave up and went back inside. Now I was truly sketched out. I knew I had to be missing something. The new neighbor was constantly looking at my house and was caught staring at me from his window. It was all so creepy and happening for seemingly no reason. I stayed up for another couple of hours, saw nothing else, but felt uneasy when I finally went to bed. It took me a long time to fall asleep, with that aching gut feeling that I was constantly being watched. I don't know how, but I finally passed out. However, I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. My whole body sat up instantly, and I felt an intense discomfort, as if something was happening. Yet the house was silent. I was wide awake, heart hammering. I turned on the lamp next to me and looked around. Everything seemed normal, but that sinking, powerful gut feeling that I was being watched still remained, pressuring me not to dismiss this. I got out of bed and walked up to the door. I reached out to open it, but in the act of unlocking it, I had a sudden, profound feeling that what I was doing was wrong, that I shouldn't unlock it and look around. I left the door locked and instead put my ear up to the wood. After a moment, I heard soft creaks in the hallway. I couldn't be sure if it was the old house settling or something else, so I knelt down and looked under the door. The hallway lights weren't on, and I saw nothing on the other side. I stayed kneeling for a few tense seconds, and then something suddenly moved past the gap. I instantly jumped back, trying to remain silent. The creaking stopped immediately. He heard me. After a moment of chilling hesitation, several loud, quick footsteps moved along the floor, right up to the other side of my room. I was still in shock, sitting up against the front of my bed, trying to be as quiet as possible. I could see the shadow of his boots directly under the door. The shadow started shifting, and then suddenly, the whole bottom of the door was covered up by something. I leaned slightly closer. Took a second to make out what it was, but I just barely saw an eye looking back at me. He was peering under the door. I jumped up, grabbed my phone, and ran to the back of the room. My hands were shaking so violently that it was difficult to even dial 911. I could hear him moving around outside the room, thumping on the floor, still trying to get in. It seemed that by the time the police were on their way and I finished the call, he was gone. The whole house was quiet again. I didn't risk checking just in case he was hiding. When the police arrived, they confirmed the house was empty. I immediately told them my suspicions about the neighbor across the street. They went over and spoke to him. It was clear he'd been awake for a while, even though it was 2 a.m. Apparently, during the questioning, the guy blew his own cover, accidentally admitting to knowing something he shouldn't have. They took him in and got the full story, confirming he was the one who broke into my home that night, and that he'd been watching me for much longer than I realized. It wasn't clear how he even found me or why he targeted me, as we had never met. The police found my name in his search history several times over the previous month, even before he moved into the neighborhood. There is a strong chance he moved specifically to live directly across from me. He had a history of similar stalking cases, so they didn't let him off easily. I shouldn't have to worry about him for a long time, but I still haven't gone a day without thinking about it. It sucks not having all the answers, but I believe he broke into my home that night for a reason far worse than just stalking me. I think he had horrible intentions, and I was lucky my gut feeling kept me from opening that door. 3. The knife in the dark. In my late 20s, I moved a few towns over for a new job. Everything went smoothly. I settled in well at work and quickly found a decent apartment. The building was small, with only 6 units, 2 per floor. My unit was on the top story, and the woman who lived across the hall was the one who gave me the tour. She owned a couple of units in the building. She was older than me, about 45, and neither friendly nor unfriendly. She was deeply non-expressive, spoke in a monotone, and had a tired, mute look on her face every time I saw her. She also looked unkempt, with long, shaggy hair. The apartment was good enough that I didn't care. I honestly thought I'd rarely ever see her anyway. Couldn't have been more wrong. On my first full day of work, I came home late, around 8 p.m. As I headed up the stairs, I found the woman standing right outside the door to my room. I was exhausted and completely unprepared to see her. I definitely made things awkward. She looked at me with her usual dead stare and then asked if this was when I usually got home from work. I thought it was an odd question, but I just said I wasn't sure yet, as I had just started the job. Without acknowledging my answer, she turned, opened her door, walked into her room, and slammed the door shut behind her. I didn't know if she meant to be rude or was angry with me, but I was too tired to think about it and just went into my unit. I fell asleep without even making dinner. I slept well, passing out until 6 a.m., when I was abruptly woken by a loud pounding at the door. I jumped out of bed, completely startled. The knocks kept coming, forcing me to walk over and open the door. The woman was standing there, looking exactly the same, almost like a walking corpse. "Can I help you?" I asked groggily, still half asleep. She produced a truly strange, fake smile and asked a bizarre question. She wanted me to come over to her place after work tonight. There was no emotion in her voice, which made the request profoundly unsettling. Something was clearly wrong. I didn't know if she meant dinner or what, but I tried to be nice and said I was busy. Without any further response, she turned and went back into her room, slamming the door shut. Since it was 6 a.m., I stayed up and got ready for work. I left at 8 o'clock and got home at 7 p.m. Thankfully, the woman wasn't outside my door this time, so I was able to get into my unit and rest without any weird confrontations. I wasn't worried so much as intensely creeped out by her bizarre, emotionless behavior. I made dinner and got into bed at 10 p.m. I set my alarm for 6:45 a.m., but I was abruptly woken again by pounding at the front door. I got up already knowing who it was. I opened the door, and there she was, the same woman with the same dull face. Even more strangely, the conversation went nearly the exact same as the previous morning. She asked the same thing for me to come over after work, and I gave the same excuse. She went back into her apartment and slammed the door, leaving me confused and uneasy. Her lack of emotion made it impossible to decipher her true intentions. I stayed up, had a small breakfast, and headed to work. The day was long again. I stayed in the office until at least 8:30 p.m. I didn't make it back to the apartment until 9:15 p.m. The lot was quiet and empty. All the lights in the building were off, as most people were probably in bed. I hoped this meant the woman wouldn't bother me tonight, and I could slip in unnoticed. I parked and went inside, trying to be quiet as I went up the stairs. When I got up to my room, she wasn't there. I sighed in relief and put my key in the door, but something was off. It was already unlocked. I froze for a second, the realization hitting me. She had to be the only other person who could have unlocked it. But even in that moment, I couldn't fully believe it. She was creepy, but surely not that creepy. I opened the door. I noticed the doorknob felt strange, but I ignored it, focused on the pressing situation. The door closed behind me as I took a few steps inside. The lights were all off, just as I had left them, but my bedroom door was open. I could hear my heart beating as I walked up and peered into my room. The woman was standing next to my bed, her face mostly covered by the shadows, but I could still make out her dull, emotionless expression. I started to mutter, "What are you doing?" But I stumbled over the words when I glanced down and saw the kitchen knife in her hand. After the moment of shock, I ran for the front door. I grabbed the handle and tried to swing it open, but almost lost my footing as it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck in the doorway. The knob wouldn't even move. I immediately knew the woman had rigged the door to lock me inside with her. In that instant, adrenaline flooded me. Instead of being scared, I was intensely angry at whatever this psycho was doing. She lunged at me, still holding the knife. But I don't think she was expecting a fight because I was very easily able to catch her off guard and wrestle the knife away. I held her down and called the police, keeping her restrained until they arrived. It was only after they got her in handcuffs that I noticed she had managed to get a quick slash on the back of my arm. It wasn't deep, but once the adrenaline faded, it wasn't exactly painless. Apparently, she had some serious disorders and hadn't been taking her proper medication for months, leading to her having an episode. That was the explanation I received from her family, but it didn't really change anything. In the end, everything worked out okay. I was able to defend myself and didn't suffer any lasting physical impacts from the ordeal. It definitely could have been 1,000 times worse.